Good afternoon. Thanks for being with us for the beginning of the afternoon session on technology and global inequality in the age of AI. We are honored to have Simon Johnson. He's a Ronald Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at MIT Sloan School of Management, where he's the head of the Global Economics and Management Group. At MIT, he's also the co-director of the Stone Center Initiative and a research affiliate at Blueprint Labs. In 2024, Simon received the Nobel Prize in Economics, joined with Aaron Acemoglu and James Robinson for studies of how institutions are formed and affect prosperity. From 2007 to 2008, Simon was the chief economist and director of the research department at the IMF. He currently co-chairs the CFA Institute Systemic Risk Council. He's a member of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation Systemic Resolution Advisory Committee. From July 2014 to early 2017, Simon was a member of the Financial Research Advisory Committee of the U.S. Treasury's Office of Financial Research, within which he chaired the Global Vulnerabilities Working Group. From February 21 to March 25, Johnson was a member of the Board of Directors of Fannie Mae, where he was vice chair of the Audit Committee, vice chair of the Compensation Committee, and a member of the Risk and Capital Committee. He has authored multiple papers, many books. Recently, he wrote with Aaron Acemoglu, Power and Progress, our 1,000-year struggle over technology and prosperity, where he explores the history and economics of major technological transformations up to and including the latest developments in AI. His previous books, one with Jonathan Gruber, Jumpstart in America, How Breakthrough Science Can Revive Economic Growth, and The American Dream. He also wrote 13 Bankers, The Wall Street Takeover, and the Next Financial Meltdown, that has become one of the mostly highly regarded books about the financial crisis. And some time ago, White House Burning, The Founding Fathers, Our National Debt, and Why It Matters for You. I guess it's today even more topical than at the time you wrote it. So it is hard to think of somebody better to help us think through the major trends affecting the world economy today. So please join me in welcoming Simon Johnson to Georgetown.
Thanks very much for those very kind words of introduction. I'll speak out over here if that's okay. And I'd like to spend the next 40 minutes talking with you about what's happening in terms of technology, particularly artificial intelligence, how we think that's going to impact the United States, but also how it's likely to impact other parts of the world. And I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to talk with you about how it may or may not impact Latin America, because these questions are very much on our mind, and you obviously know an enormous amount about this. So it's technology and global inequality in the age of AI. That's my topic. And just to give you the summary points, because I'm going to cover a lot of material and I want to make sure I tell you what my conclusions are at the beginning. At least at MIT and probably at Georgetown and probably almost everywhere else right now, you hear two very different views about the potential impact of artificial intelligence. One is what I think we can call techno-optimism. AI will be so incredibly enhancing of productivity that you won't have to worry about anything else ever again. These views are definitely out there. The other view is, of course, exact opposite, extreme techno-pessimism. AI is going to destroy jobs and maybe many other parts of our social fabric, and it could even be one of our most catastrophic inventions. So our view, me and my friends, I'll talk about my friends in a moment, is actually somewhere in between. We think that it is an important technology. It is going to change many things about how we work and how we organize our lives. We are not, however, expecting a massive productivity miracle. And this matters because you can still have, and I'll talk about historical episodes, you can still have a big shift in inequality of money, income, wealth, and also power without necessarily having an acceleration of productivity growth. And in some ways, that could be one of the most difficult combinations to deal with. But the main point of this talk and the book that I wrote with Ron Acemoglu, Power and Progress, and our continuing work at MIT with Jaron and also David Autor, the labor economist. Our main focus is to say it doesn't have to be this way. the technology always provides us with a choice. There's an absolute definite choice in the United States, in and around the tech sector, with the people who are inventing this technology. But there's also a broader social and you might say political choice in the US in terms of how the technology develops, what capabilities become salient, and how does that interact with different kinds of people's skills and opportunities. I also think, although this is more speculative, but I think in every country in the world, there are opportunities to shape how AI is used. At the same time, it's always going to be important to recognize what's coming to you from this, well, you can say global marketplace. I mean, frankly, it's a few people on the West Coast, primarily on the West Coast of the United States. So what they invent is going to reshape the world in some ways, but you can still choose within that how your society, how your economy is going to adapt and how it's going to use these opportunities, and who is going to win and who is not going to win in this technological transformation. So the book is Power and Progress, came out in 2023. We work on these issues at what's now called MIT Stone Center for Inequality and the Future of Work. The book is by me and Drona Samoglu. As I mentioned, David Autor is our co-director of this initiative. And I did have an opportunity recently to speak with one of the leading luminaries of the nascent AI industry. Okay, it was Sam Altman. And I said to Sam, okay, what about the jobs? Because AI is obviously going to replace people in many of their current tasks. We'll talk more about that context in a moment. And Sam said, Simon, don't worry. You and I will be playing with galaxies. I thought, well, okay, I'm not against playing with galaxies. That sounds like a lot of fun. But really, that's the answer, that the expansion of human capabilities is going to be so vast that we're going to be beyond this solar system within my lifetime? I'm not so sure. And this book and this work and this talk is about what is more likely to happen in the nearer term, although perhaps this ultimately takes humans to the stars. We'll see what your views are on that too. Oh, and I will also say a few things along the way about the work that won Dron and me and Jim Robinson the Nobel Prize. I actually woke up October 14th last year and somewhat puzzled and stunned by the news. I thought it was a hoax until I saw this drawing on the internet put out by the Nobel Foundation. I thought, well, if it's a hoax, then somebody's invested a lot of money in doing this drawing, and it wasn't a hoax. They actually liked the work that we had done, the three of us, about 25 years ago, between 25 and 20 years ago, on how institutions affect, where institutions come from, where the rule of law comes from, where democracy comes from, and how that impacts prosperity. So I'll make a few points about that along the way, because I think it's highly relevant to today and to tomorrow in terms of how the technology and AI develops. So the first, and I think most important thing is to recognize, and perhaps even to agree, that every technology that we've ever experienced is born into a particular society. That it comes with a vision, it's presented to us by some people, they have thoughts about how they want to live, how other people around them should live. So social context matters a lot, and always has mattered for invention. So what is the social context of the United States? What is this moment in which the AI is being born? Well, I think the top picture here tells us a great deal about that. This is what's happened to earnings for men in the United States since, well, over the past 40 to 50 years. The pattern for women is in the lower picture. It is similar, but not exactly the same. If we looked at other industrial countries, again, there are similar patterns. The US is, among major economies, the most extreme. And you can see that as a result of, I mean, we can put whatever labels you want on it, some combination of technology transformation, digital revolution, and yes, globalization, along with some other social phenomena, such as I'll talk about, including decline of trade unions. The earnings of men with a lot of education, including beyond college education, have risen quite nicely over those decades. The wages of men who didn't finish high school have been basically flat for decades in the United States. Now, in the middle, in this graph, of course, there's an intermediate outcome, but the thing to remember is that the pressure on the middle class has been manifest not just in earnings, but also in the number of jobs for which you can receive this kind of income. And as a result of successive waves of or continuing process, a steady process of automation compounded by some particular trade shocks, including what some people call the China shock that came in the early 2000s. Many of the jobs that were in the middle income, middle skill, middle education category in the United States, those jobs were eliminated. In the United States, as you know, we don't do mass unemployment. We also don't have anything you would call an active labor market policy. In fact, one of my expert friends likes to say the US labor market policy can be simply summed up as get another job. So if you lose your job, you lost your job in the middle, and there aren't many jobs in the middle, you get pushed down to the lower end of the labor market where it's very hard to make a living. So this is the pattern that we have experienced in recent decades. When I first came to the United States to study for a PhD at MIT in 1985, I was 10 years old. The US struck me as being relatively unequal compared to the UK where I was from. It was relatively entrepreneurial, and people were less worried about redistribution. That was sort of striking. And also views of economists, including my contemporaries, including the professors I had at MIT. If AI was being born in 1980, if it was born in 1985 in its modern version as opposed to today, that's a fundamentally different society in terms of inequality of income and inequality of wealth than what we're living in today. And it is entirely possible that AI could exacerbate this divergence because, as I mentioned, as I described the pattern in the data, part of this change is due to what economists call skill-biased technological change. The term can be a little confusing. It basically means that people who have a lot of skill, a lot of education, actually probably pretty much everyone in this room, everyone listening to my voice now or in any recording, most people like you do well as technology develops, have done well from digital technology, and will continue to do well. So AI is likely to boost your productivity, and that may well play out, that productivity gain may play out in ways that increase your income. But for other people, less advantaged, with less opportunity, previous digital transformation has done that. AI is not so likely to do that. One CEO I spoke to about this said, and I don't advise you to use this terminology, it's not nice terminology, but this is from a CEO, and I just want to give you an example of one person, but also actually a fairly standard view in some parts of corporate America today. He said, yes, Simon, AI is going to replace people who have cut and paste jobs. So the job has some repetitive element. It's not entirely repetitive because entirely repetitive tasks have been largely automated already, but the job has substantial repetitive elements. Now these are, in the first instance, white-collar jobs. They are we'll talk some more about the kinds of people who have the sort of jobs we think are in the immediate line of fire. And that's not necessarily the end of the story, because in any technological transformation, it matters what are the new opportunities that are created, and can you go on to seize those new opportunities? But without question, and you're seeing this now, the book came out 2 years ago, you're seeing it in the news headlines of Amazon's announced job cuts last week, for example, specifically saying we don't need so many white-collar workers, we are automating their tasks, their functions, using versions of AI. This is coming much more broadly to this society, and I think to all societies. And of course, that's the big question for you and for this institute and for all of us, which is what happens around the world? So the world has made some progress in terms of closing some gaps. There's still very big differences in income per capita and opportunity, obviously, around the world. To the extent that countries have risen based on manufacturing or services where there's a cost advantage, a low-cost labor advantage, it's already the case that AI can automate a great deal of the white-collar functions and services. Bringing AI to manufacturing is a little bit more, there is some automation, a high degree of automation in the assembly of vehicles, for example, but a lot of manufacturing is not fully digitized and therefore not so easy to bring AI to. But I have many brilliant colleagues at MIT and elsewhere who are working really hard to bring AI to manufacturing. So if it's the case that some countries previously were able to develop first by being low cost, low skill, and then raising their skill level and getting high wages, what happens to that development ladder? I think that's a very relevant and timely and difficult question. And a question, by the way, on which we have not much data. So if you're thinking about things to study and promising topics, I commend this one to you. Now, just a word about institutions and the institutional context and why I think it's relevant. So what we did in the work that drew the attention of the people who award Nobel Prizes is look at the history of European colonization and ask the question of what did the Europeans do around the world? And obviously, there are some people who say the Europeans had very positive influences. There's other people for a long time who pointed out that Europeans had very negative influences. If you think in terms of economic development, and you think in terms of income per capita today, you can see some very distinctive paths, and I've divided them here for simplicity into two. In places where the Europeans decided they wanted to settle and come in large numbers themselves, so the European immigration was regarded as an appealing part of the colonization strategy. They built better institutions for themselves, better rule of law for themselves, and that encouraged private sector investment and the development of societies actually rather like this one. In places where the Europeans didn't want to go, primarily because it was so unhealthy for Europeans, actually the Europeans tried to move almost everywhere. And some places the mortality rate was rather like in Europe. That's the case in North America. Some places a little bit more healthy than Europe. That was the case in Australia. In other places, it was shockingly unhealthy for Europeans. And if you sent 1,000 Europeans, for example, to West Africa around 1800 or up to 1850, about half of them would die in the first 2 years. So these death rates severely discouraged migration. And in those places, the Europeans did not back off. They did not withdraw. They retained a great deal of influence and in some cases control. And they built institutions that were not favorable to the broad cross-section of society. Yeah, the rules helped the people who were running the place, that was the Europeans, not everybody else. And after colonization collapsed, after the colonies collapsed, a lot of these institutional histories persisted and continued to influence places. So history is not predetermination. There's plenty of choices that can be made, but there is a very strong weight of these historical colonial experiences. Actually, in some places, including in the Americas, geographic areas that were more developed, such as the Aztec or Inca empires, subsequently experienced less economic growth than areas that were relatively less developed, such as North America. That's the impact, long-lasting impact of not the institutions the Europeans brought, because the Europeans brought institutions everywhere, but what kind did they bring? Did they bring institutions that were pro-private sector, that encouraged investment, that helped to build what has become modern industrial economies? And having said that, of course, I have to emphasize, and I think this is particularly salient point in the United States today, partly because of where we are in terms of thinking about our institutions and their legitimacy, but partly because some people would like to airbrush out difficult parts of the American history. So even though the US built, on a comparative per capita basis, an average basis, inclusive institutions, and institutions that favored many people, including those European immigrants I mentioned, the rules of the game that the Europeans created were absolutely not favorable to everybody, including to people who were slaves. And it's even worse than that, because while the American system of slavery was absolutely dreadful at the time of independence, when the textile industry began to industrialize in Britain, and when the demand for cotton rose, this coincided with some technological innovations, including in the preparation of cotton, the cotton gin in the United States. And that combination of increased demand and an ability to cultivate cotton away from the US East Coast in what we now call the Deep South, that resulted in the forced migration of more than 1 million African American slaves under absolutely dreadful conditions, and to work on cotton plantations, which were, as far as I can see, some of the absolute worst living and working conditions ever invented by humans. So all of this took place within the United States. And of course, emancipation, I mean, my point in the broader context was you have to live with and grapple with the historical aftermath of those long-standing institutions. Emancipation in the United States was followed by a denial of civil rights, voter suppression, segregation, lynchings, penal labor systems, and state-condoned violence against African Americans. So within the United States, on which we have positive things to say on average, and in terms of our potential for dealing with technology, we have also had instances of some of the most extractive institutions ever. So what happens when economic development goes right? New technology arises. How does it play out in a way that really benefits a lot of people? Well, in 1851, the British held a great exhibition in a crystal palace, a special built glass palace in Hyde Park in Britain. And they invited the entire world to show up and present their most impressive industrial wares. The British were feeling pretty good about themselves, and they thought they would do well in this comparison. And the United States sent a delegation, and at least what they put on display initially in 1851 was some stuffed animals, and I don't mean fluffy toys, I mean animals that they had shot, and the guns they'd used to shoot the animals. Yes, so there was some hilarity in the British press about, oh, look at these Americans, 50 years of independence, you know, what have they achieved? By 1890, the United States was the greatest industrial power in the history of the world and has never looked back. So how did the US go from being a relatively agrarian economy with not much by way of technological innovation to being the world's #1 industrial power and pushing forward the innovations I'll describe in a moment? Well, I've been to New York Harbor and checked the Statue of Liberty for myself, and it definitely does not say, send me only people with PhDs in computer science. The US took in an enormous number of relatively uneducated European immigrants and went from a population of about less than 5 million at the time of independence to over 100 million in 1900, in part because 33 million people moved to the United States and they had children. But the key thing is these were not skilled workers. These were people who wanted to work hard, the people who were looking for a better life, and people who went to work in American factories that the economic historians have long called the American system of manufacturing, where you bring unskilled people in, you train them, you retain them, their productivity goes up, and eventually, after a fair amount of discussion, for sure, and some strikes, you pay them a much better wage. And this technology, this way of enhancing the productivity and sharing the benefits of that productivity with the workers, this spread around the world. This was a major export from the United States by the end of the 19th century. The people who got traction first in Britain and in the United States were people who had a little bit of skill, some artisanal abilities. Joel Mokyr, who just won the Nobel Prize in Economics this year, a great award, calls them the tinkerers. So people who are willing to build things with their hands. And that's important for part of what comes later. They improved steam engines, they built railways, they created high-skill, high-paying jobs for the working class, for people who came into these firms, started working for railway companies without a lot of skill. And this propels economic growth through the 19th century. When Henry Ford arrived in Detroit around 1900, there were about 20,000 people building cars. It was a handcrafted industry, and they were making about 20,000 cars. Henry Ford brought two things to car production, and to be clear, it wasn't just Ford, it was his engineers, his managers, and also his competitors, the entire ecosystem around Detroit. But Ford in particular brought the assembly of motor vehicles onto a moving production line, and then he brought electricity to that production line, and that combination raised the productivity of assembling vehicles dramatically. So what Ford did, and it's very important to be clear about this, was that he replaced people with machines. That's automation. And that is central to any major technological transformation. You have to call it what it is. You have to look it in the eye. But you also have to look at the fact that by 1929, the auto industry employed 300,000 people, and Ford and GM together were making 3 million cars. Now, most of those 3 million people were doing things, tasks, that humans had never done before. And that's the magic of successful technological transformations, is you get automation, you replace humans in some tasks, but you also create a lot of new tasks for humans to take on. And this is very important. In those new tasks, if you're really going to talk about sharing the benefits, you need to, the employers need to value human expertise. If the task can be done by anybody you hired off the street yesterday and you'll hire another person tomorrow or today, you're not going to pay a premium wage. You're not going to care about retaining them. If you require them to build some expertise as a railway engineer, as someone who drives a locomotive, as somebody who helps manage some part of the production process in your factory, then you're going to pay them a premium wage. That's the combination. And to be absolutely clear, trade unions played a very important part of this because there were big productivity gains, the workers were valued, but they weren't being paid. They had not received an increase in wages commensurate with the increase in productivity big union organization, arguments, strikes in Britain in the 19th century, in the United States, 19th century and early 20th century. Just to give you a sense of the enormous productive capacity of what was built in this country by the people who came before us. When the US became involved in World War II in December 1941, the country had a total of 6 aircraft carriers that were in operation. By the summer of 1945, the US was building 1 aircraft carrier a month. I mean, this was just a phenomenal transformation of the economy into military production, but it also an indication of the capacity and capabilities of this society. Now, what has happened subsequent, of course, is a bit more complicated. The top picture is US real wages. So there's an adjustment here, attempt to adjust for purchasing power. We'll take that out in a couple of slides. But for now, you can see the US has got relatively high wages when this series starts in 1950. These are the wages for what is classified as low-skilled workers. So the red line is the United States. And you can see, as I pointed out, from the 1970s, there's not much increase in real wages for that category of labor. The black line is Japan. And so this is what economic development should look like. This is what success looks like. Actually, real wages in Japan don't increase that much, despite a lot of rebuilding after World War II, until the 1970s. And then they take off steadily, and they move to be close to where the US is. So in the 1960s, if you were looking for low-cost labor around the world, Japan was on the list. Not today. The bottom 2 lines are China and India, which, as you know, had varying degrees of economic development. And China in particular has, by some accounts, and in some dimensions that I mentioned, certainly made some impressive improvements. But in terms of wages of low-skilled workers, not so much in these data. Now, notice that the data stop after 2007 for China. And if you have access to more recent data from China, don't give it to me, because that'll get you into big trouble with the Chinese government. These data have been suppressed. So you can draw whatever conclusion you want from that. So what is AI going to do? If this is the way that the US economy has operated in the past, if this is how technological transformations have happened, and this is how the world works, what should we be expecting from artificial intelligence? Well, clearly it's going to displace labor through automation. I think that absolutely is unavoidable. It's precisely the goal of many of the people working on this technology. And to be honest, there's not anything necessarily wrong with that by itself. The key thing is, will it also create new tasks for humans? And, of course, related, how fast will it create those new tasks? Work done by David Autor, my co-director of the group we have at MIT, points out that more than 60% of US jobs in 2018 did not exist in 1940. So this economy is actually quite good at generating new tasks. And this is where you see the entrepreneurship. This is where you see the new business creation that's been strong in the United States for decades. But it wasn't strong enough, because the wage picture that I showed you at the beginning, the flat wages for lower skilled workers, and also the people being pushed out of the middle class, that's because we didn't create enough new tasks valuing human expertise. So this is our starting point. Now, there's a lot of research on a very hot and emerging question. And again, if you're looking for topics, I highly recommend this, because I don't think we have at all come close to establishing what the pattern's going to be. But certainly it's possible that AI can be used to upskill workers. So there are some evidence that it could help people with less formal education. It could help people with less experience. It could help people who are not so good at coding or not so good at writing. So if AI can raise people up, lower productivity, lower skilled people, raise their productivity, and if that becomes higher pay, then that could be a big plus. It's also the case that many studies, and I've got a number of prominent industry studies here, suggest that people do not already have the skills to take advantage of AI, and that could be something that slows down adoption, slows down economic transformation of the economy. So again, focusing on those mismatches and attempting to help people find the skills that they need, that could be a very attractive area for universities, for schools, maybe even for government. We'll come back to that. If you look at what AI is known to be good at today and who has a job that includes tasks that AI can do now or relatively easily, then it is the case that women and younger workers are more immediately at risk. It doesn't mean that their outcomes necessarily be worse. Again, it depends on the new tasks that will be created and their ability to adapt. But this is what comes out of various studies that have tried to look at that direct impact. I have to also say and emphasize that people who are in the industry and very close to the labs, obviously what's actually being invented in the labs is not publicly available. We know there's a huge amount of capital going in. We know there's a vast amount of talent from around the world being put into these activities. But people who are very close to these activities and who have an ability to share some information feel that nobody actually knows anything about what's being invented and what its capabilities are. It's a massive rush to invent without constraints, without, I think, substantial or significant safeguards. It's just an incredible arms race between the technology companies. So these are all tentative findings in that sense. Now, there are optimistic macroeconomic forecasts. They're available from various investment banks and other people. I think a more sober assessment suggests there is some productivity gain, but it's relatively modest. John Williams, who's the president of the New York Fed, I think has the right assessment, which is there's going to be AI. AI will have an impact, but it's not going to accelerate the productivity trend growth in the United States. It's going to be part of how the US stays on the same trend, 1 to 1.5% productivity growth. And, you know, I think we have to grapple with the fact, and you have to grapple with the fact, that China has made massive steps in terms of scientific investigation and research and development. It's actually challenging the United States in multiple sectors, both existing sectors and potential future sectors. And we can take you through the details if you're interested. But at the same time, it remains in large part a low-wage economy. The Chinese wage line has not risen like the Japanese wage line did. And that, I think, has a major impact on the world. These are nominal wages, so I'm not trying to adjust for purchasing power or anything. If you're a global corporation, you're looking for places to produce, these are the numbers in terms of dollars. Who's cheap and who's not cheap in terms of production. And that, I think, casts a long shadow over the world economy that we can talk about. Now, what should you do? Well, John Gruber and I published a book in 2019 talking about economic development in the United States and emphasizing that if we increased our spending on science and spread it around the country, this could have a major transformative impact. Most of the innovation that happens in the United States happens in relatively few places, and increasingly, in fact, the book was written before the current wave of AI, a huge amount of the concentration is on the East Coast, particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area. The US invested federal government put almost no money into research and development before World War II. It was the lessons of that experience that taught it that not only was scientific knowledge and scientific workforce, not only was it valuable for military purposes and national security, you could also get tremendous commercial value from it. And that's what the US did for 60 years subsequently, at a little bit of a tapering off, to be honest. So our proposal was to spend more and to distribute it around the country, because there's more than 100 cities in 36 states that, in our analysis, could absorb some of this investment and spin out companies from universities and develop themselves into some sort of tech hubs. Not suggesting that we try to create multiple Silicon Valleys. I don't think that's feasible. But in terms of federally funded scientific research that generates commercially viable products and services, distributing that more broadly around the United States, that's what we used to do. That was the history of American manufacturing and the history of American scientific innovation that had practical purposes. It's only recently that we've become so concentrated. And, you know, honestly, big part of the problem, including discussions of the affordability crisis in various places, including New York City, is because places that have a lot of innovation and a lot of high productivity activities connected to that innovation don't build housing. So if you don't build housing and people try to move to your city because that's where the jobs are, you have a big increase in rents. It's that combination overly concentrating the opportunities and not building housing that is proving so toxic in so many places. And we proposed ways to actually operationalize these ideas, some of which were picked up in the 2022 Chips and Science Act. I don't think it's going to happen now. I think the country, or maybe one person in the country, has turned against this sufficiently. But this has been and can be the American response. Create more new tasks for humans. Do it through invention. Run faster in terms of new task creation than automation. The private sector is going to automate a lot of jobs, like it or not. That's coming. You can't stop it. In fact, you know, we could spend some time, and I was happy to take questions on potential government policy. You know, there's plenty of ideas you can come up with, but the key problem is that the tech industry, or the part of the tech industry pushing for faster AI, has persuaded people in positions of power in Washington, D.C., that any break on AI development would be handing a national security advantage and maybe a commercial advantage to China. And that point is raised in any conversation where potential constraints are proposed. So this is a problem for jobs. It's a problem for social media. It's a problem for democracy. And compounding that by cutting spending, federal R&D spending, is just going to massively exacerbate the problems in our job market. And I have various ideas and thoughts and projects to talk to you about what we do in response to this, and we can talk about that. And I'll also just end on this personal note, because when you win the Nobel Prize, and I do encourage you all to go for that. I mean, why not? Honestly, because once upon a time I was sitting in the audience with you. They invite you to submit one artifact to the Nobel Prize Museum in Stockholm. It's a good museum, by the way. I highly recommend it if you're going to be in Stockholm. And I gave them my grandfather's passport. My grandfather was a metallurgist who helped to run a big steel mill in Sheffield in the north of England, where I was born. And this is a special passport because he went to the United States in May 1942, just after the US had entered World War II. He went to the US to discuss the building of tanks, and particularly tank tracks, on which he was an expert. My grandfather, Cyril Dadswell, did not come to the United States to learn how to build tanks. He'd been building tanks for a number of years with some success. He came to the United States to transfer his knowledge to the Americans so they could build tanks, which turned out to be even better. And this is the moment when the United States took global scientific and technological leadership. Before 1940, the US won almost no Nobel Prizes in physics, biology, and chemistry. After 1945, we've dominated. Why? Because we committed to science, we put the money in, we built the talent, we pulled people to the United States, and we focused on creating things that are useful. That's what we can do again. That's what we should do again. The Nobel Prize in Chemistry last year was won by Dempsey Cyrus and John Jumper for inventing AlphaFold 2, which is an AI technology to help predict the folding of proteins, very useful for example, in inventing drugs. Now, I said we got our Nobel Prize for work we did 25 years ago. They waited 4 years from publishing their paper to Nobel Prize. That's how useful that breakthrough is. That's fantastic. We should do more of that. DeepMind, which is what they created, is now owned by Google. The other big Google innovation coming to you in this town very soon is Waymo. What is Waymo? Waymo is a replacing of your Uber and other drivers with a machine. When Uber displaced taxis, I think those of us who used to ride around in taxis in Washington, D.C., breathed a sigh of relief because the service was not that good. Number of people employed, it wasn't good news for taxi drivers, it wasn't good news for people who own taxi companies. Number of people working as urban chauffeurs stayed roughly, actually increased a little bit. Wages stayed roughly the same. Now you're getting Waymo, you're going to be replacing those people. There's 7 million people work as drivers in the United States. 4 million, roughly speaking, drive primarily in urban areas. The pressure is coming. Those jobs are going to be eliminated. This technology is available to everybody around the world all at once. Right? That's the key thing about digital technology. I think ChatGPT was used by I mean, I've never met anywhere, any corner of the world, I've not heard of anybody who wasn't using it within 24, 48 hours of its release. So same technology, same forms of automation. What are you doing to create new tasks? In the US, we know what we need to do. Create more science, create more useful things, push that frontier. What's the rest of the world going to do? What's the rest of the world going to do with this massive competitive pressure centered on and coming from China on the low cost side? I think that is a very big question. The book is Power and Progress. It's available in 20 languages. And if you don't want to read a 500-page book, you can also download for free the 20-page comic version, which was put together by some brilliant young people at Boston University, working under Professor Joel Gill there. Fantastic. It's an easy read. And maybe it'll have you read the long book, even if it just engages you with the topics, it's worth it. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Yeah, you have it timed to the minute.
Sometimes.
Thank you very much, Simon. And as you think of your questions, let me just start with a couple of issues. I thought you were going to end that you can ask ChatGPT to give you a summary of the book, no? So I think that
Too easy.
yeah, but
It does a good job, by the way, if you do
yeah.
it. Yeah.
So a couple of things. One is that you say that the industry blocks any discussion, intent on regulation, but what you highlighted are potential policies for society to take advantage of this technology in a way that it's beneficial to a large part of society were all positive things. I think you mentioned invest more in R&D. I mean, affordability issues, so we can create more poles in which new activities can rise, etc. What are the issues that you and your co-authors have thought in terms of, let's say, more heavy-handed regulation that are being opposed by the industry? And second is, what are your arguments to demythify the competition vis-a-vis China as well? That it's, I think once you put China in the sentence in Washington, D.C., you might generate some bipartisan agreement. So it's a very powerful argument by the industry, no?
Yeah, absolutely. So I attended a House Representatives Task Force dealing with AI a couple of years ago. And it was a private or closed door meeting, so there were no cameras. And it was a very different conversation from what you usually experience on the Hill, meaning that there was a lot of bipartisan agreement. And the people, by the way, were very well informed about AI, right? So the consensus, I would say, at least my takeaway from that meeting, was that the representatives said, look, you don't know exactly what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to go wrong. You don't know what the Chinese are doing. So sure, there may be harms. This was 2 years ago. I think we can identify some of the harms more clearly now. There may be harms, but you asked me to put a brake on the process when there's competition that could take some advantage. And the commercial advantage is bad enough and taking jobs we could otherwise have. But what if it's a national security issue? Well, you just can't get past that. That's why I emphasize more of the positive agenda now. But I do think that over time, there will be discussion about privacy, because clearly there's big infringements of privacy. The effect on children, including mental health related to children. We can see a lot of this emerging now. I think ChatGPT said, OpenAI said last week, they said less than 1% of people using ChatGPT suffer or use it in a way that encourages their hallucinations. I mean, that is about 500 million people around the world, that number, okay? So you start to think that that's disconcerting. And I think surveillance, actually. So one thing the left and the right can agree on, including in Washington, is they don't like surveillance. They think different people are surveilling them, but they don't like surveillance. So I think we will get that, Alejandro, but we will have to have some scandals and some awful experiences, and then there'll be legislation, hopefully, that addresses it. But preemptively trying to push the technology in one way or the other, or restrain it from taking on certain things, that's not very likely.
And then a follow-up question on the labor issue, because I mean, all your charts point towards, I mean, we might find ourselves in a situation in which we do have another significant period of stagnation, of decline, of low wages in the US. And we haven't done anything for 60 years to tackle that. Again, to have some kind of response, we will have to go through a crisis, through a political crisis that drives those issues to the forefront? Or do you see some ideas that are being discussed that eventually could come to?
The Chips and Science Act of 2022 was bipartisan. I think 65 senators supported it. Big investment in semiconductors, but also a commitment to more spending on science and spreading around the country. That was extremely encouraging. And I think that is, my view, the best idea out there, along with other ideas about building more housing where you need it and so on. But that we have backed away from, Alejandro. I think the problem, as you know very well from your experience in many other parts of the world, is that sometimes you have this long stagnation or massive disappointment of expectations, or a lot of young people who can't get jobs. And that feeds into the political process in a way that isn't necessarily pushing things towards what you and I would consider to be even reasonably sensible economic policies, right? So populism obviously can mean different things to different people, but sometimes I think it's most descriptive as a set of ideas that actually make things worse. People get more angry and then they vote more populist, right? So the feedback loop is not necessarily to be relied on in the general macro terms. I do think that if you see a specific instance of awful treatment of children, you tend to get more protection of children. So that maybe works. But in the macro, stagnation, disappointment, a lost generation, or whatever terminology is used, that might help us get to a different path, but I'm not absolutely confident on that.
So in a way, I mean, the absence of early action might eventually drive us to a bad policy response confronted with a big problem.
I think, and honestly, the US has a lot of resilience. And as an immigrant, I'm very pro-US and believe very strongly in the US. If I'm wrong, of course, I wasted 40 years of my life. So, understand, I have confirmation bias there. But I think if you think about, we're good at creating new companies. We're quite flexible, and people have repeatedly proven ability to deal with various difficult problems. So I think this is going to be hard for us, but I think it's going to be much harder for other places. Places that don't create a lot of, so the European economy, not as dynamic, right? Places that don't have as strong institutions, with the caveats I put on our institutions. If you don't have good rule of law, if you're not pro-private sector, if it's hard to make investments in a place, if you tend to have even more political instability than we have, those are all going to catch up with you. And then we have this pressing, the billions of people who want to work, they want to export, they're willing to work for 1/20th or 1/50th of what people around us want to work for. This combination is going to be difficult.
Well, I think we should open the floor for questions. Alberto?
Hi, you are in academia.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I think one of the brilliant promises of AI is it could transform education, that we could break down a lot of the hierarchies and a lot of the rigidities, which you think might be challenging to universities and maybe some will struggle. But I think a place like MIT or Georgetown could absolutely thrive if more people can be connected with the knowledge and there's less of the barriers and less of the difficulties of accessing it. One problem we obviously, I think we obviously have in the US is that universities, in this moment included, universities are seen as elitist and out of touch and benefiting only relatively few people. I don't think that's the history, as I talked about that, and I don't think that's actually what they can and should do. But then it's on the universities to do something different and to make their knowledge more accessible to people in ways that are useful to people. And the big promise of AI, without question, is reaching billions of people around the world who can't go to school because the school doesn't function, the teacher doesn't show up, the school building doesn't exist anymore, and allowing them to educate themselves and to find their way to a better path. Sometimes I tell my audiences that the question before us is, which Neil Stephenson novel will we live in? Okay, not that many science fiction readers here. Neil Stephenson has written a number of dystopian science fiction novels in which this kind of technology goes wrong, and he's way ahead of his time. Really fascinating reading. But he also wrote a book called The Diamond Age, in which AI is used by young people, young disenfranchised women, actually, in China, in that novel, to educate themselves and to raise themselves up in their position in the world through self-education powered by the technology. So I think that is a very big opportunity And I think universities should embrace that and push it really hard, honestly, including my own.
Yeah, over there.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I had a question specifically, a two-folded question. One was related to how do you see the narrative in the construction of AI systems specifically? I'm currently enrolled in a course which is titled AI and Human Rights in Latin America, and we have seen a discrepancy when it comes to the design of AI systems and how that can be construed from a Western perspective and often leave out intrinsic issues that pertain regions in the global South, like Latin America. I kind of was curious to see what are your insights specifically on the AI design system, if you have found that in your research. And then similarly, what do you think should be done by governments that are sort of trying to get ahead, like countries in Latin America, regarding this issue?
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
it's a great question. Look, I think we know what's in the design. It's what's in the minds and what the priorities are for the inventors. And the inventors are driven by the market. And the market is rich people in the United States. In fact, maybe it's rich people in San Francisco, if you think about the way that Waymo taxis, for example, have been rolled out. So I think it seems self-evident that the imprinting of the vision of the creators on any technology is super important. And on this one, it's absolutely going to be building systems that reinforce their views and that deliver services that they think are important to people. And then the flip side of that, and I'm glad you asked the questions together, is if you're a government or a private sector or universities working with people in other countries, such as Latin America, what you should do is, I don't think you should try and compete on the base models. That's a massive capital investment. The talent has been pulled in the United States. You can't afford to build that. But what you can build is applications, and what you can build is filters, and you can address exactly why this doesn't work for my country because it's leaving out this. And when you build that, you shouldn't build it shouldn't say, well, look, we're just putting in a safeguard. I mean, it is a safeguard, but you should also say, we're building something here that we can sell to other people. Because other people are also going to be concerned about the fact this American West Coast technology is coming all at once. So let's help people use it in ways that are consistent with our beliefs and what we think is important, and be very transparent about that. So I'd like to say a nice thing about Google. I only have one nice thing to say about them, but I'd like to say it, which is that they announced a deal actually AlphaFold 2 is great technology, that's them, but so I have two things. But they announced a deal with the World Bank at the meetings just now to help a lot of poor farmers around the world use AI. Now, we'll see how they get on, but I think there's a great role for the World Bank, actually, to try and bring capital, coordinate knowledge, presumably have a lot of stakeholders there. The idea would not be to oppress 1 billion farmers. It would be to help liberate them and help make them more prosperous, right? So I think that's not easy, but a very valiant goal. And that would be on the positive path and a big win for the idea that we can harness AI in a positive way. Or you decide how you want. Don't listen to me. You decide for yourselves how you want to use AI. That would be my proposition.
Other question? Yeah.
Hi, works? Yeah. So I'm going to take up the sci-fi challenge that you just threw out there.
This is Eduardo Porter. He has a great Substack. You should all subscribe to it. There. That should lighten the question, make the question more positive.
No. Just to this point of how the vision of the creator is going to ultimately decide the decision or play a big role in where the technology goes. And I'm thinking about the people that are making the base models. And I'm thinking back to your first quote from Sam Altman. Now, it seems to me that a lot of these creators actually are seriously thinking about the stars. It's not like they read, the Diamond Age. And you have a lot of them supporting ideas like, yes, what we need to do is populate the galaxies with human intelligence. And then they go further because, meat and bones are not a very efficient way to do this. Well, we've got to think of a post-biological human. They call themselves, substrate agnostic. So we'll go in the form of, I don't know, toasters or fridges into the orbit and populate the Milky Way. And I wonder, how seriously did they take this? Because it's not just Altman, it's like Page and Brin and I think all of them have some version of this dream in their head. How much does that matter? And how much, should we be worried that, the guys that are basically in control of the basic block of this technology are thinking in these terms?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, I think everyone should read more science fiction. And if I can send you my 12-page recommended science fiction list. I rank all my science fiction on my bookshelf, and I re-rank them every year, depending on who I think is moving up or down on the prediction side. It's much more interesting than economics, and much more informative about the future, too, to be honest. So I think this grandiose vision really does matter because it disconnects people inventing the technology from what the world needs currently, which is much more mundane and much more much harder to find solutions to. And I think you know the best way to deal with that is the previous question asked, which is like, what's in it for us, and why hasn't this benefited us, and to what extent is it pulling our society in the wrong direction? So I think the counter narratives, Eduardo, are really very important, including telling stories, including telling fiction stories, including imagine. Now I'm talking about my own science fiction novel, which is almost finished. So I won't give away too much, but imagining alternatives of how it goes wrong, right? And then thinking about that and putting that up against it and saying, okay, how do we get a better solution? And I do think that the outcome is not determined entirely by the machines or by the people who invented the machines. It's always the human-machine interaction, right? So which way do we pull the machines? But if you sit back and you're passive and you just take it as given, then you know it's forces beyond your control, and that's going to be pretty frustrating.
Thank you. So I'm 32. What do young professionals or recent graduates, what can we focus on learning? What type of skills or subject areas while these new tasks and new jobs are created when we may not be necessarily in the position of creating those jobs per se, given our generation? We are like the buffer generation. What would you recommend?
Yeah, so I have a lot of students who are your age, around your age, and I think that the world is full of difficult problems that have not been solved. And I think taking on those problems and making them a priority and becoming expert in those issues is super important and really fulfilling. And I think when you do that, it's good to think about what are the capabilities of AI today, where does it seem to be going, and position yourself to take advantage of those. So use AI, and we teach courses on this at MIT, and we have open material you can look at on this. Lots of other people do too. But figuring out how to use AI to power yourself and empower the people around you and not get trampled by it, right? So you don't want to be doing exactly what AI is going to be good at next, but you want to be doing something that AI you think will not soon be able to do. And then we can discuss the details of that. Is it the human-to-human connection? Is it really understanding human experiences that are very far from life in Silicon Valley? Is it understanding parts of the world that have never been digitized, that are not written down, right? Because these models are primarily based on digital records and extrapolation from existing digital records. So you decide what matters to you and find something that's you really care about and that has some value to others. And I think the rest should follow. Clearly, pursuing relatively generic careers, at least initially, in the white-collar space, that's becoming more difficult. I think there's a cyclical element to that, I'm sure. There's a post-COVID element, there's a cyclical element, there's maybe some other elements. But AI is coming for those jobs, absolutely. So try to find something new, something humans haven't done before. And we're not short of problems, right? We're not short of really difficult problems to address.
I think we have time for a final question. Yeah.
Every technological change also goes along with cultural change, no? I, as a faculty here, attend every other AI bootcamp. Is some professors that attend this kind of bootcamps, but actually, and I just teach quantitative methods, and I bring students ideas of LLMs and also how to implement AI in their own research. But at some point, there is some faculty that they are that not so open to embrace AI openness within, and we have open AI forums. So I would like to hear some recommendations for your experience.
If that's the White House, tell them I'll come back.
So
Yes.
in here virtual AI forums, so it's open for professors Georgetown raise that funds, but there are some other students that don't have like faculty that are so open about that. So
Yeah.
it's like,
Okay, I can't imagine how this would go wrong, me advising Georgetown faculty. Look, I think the at the House of Representatives task force meeting that I attended, the chair or the co-chair of the committee said at some point, you know, that when he was in high school or middle school perhaps, the teacher said, "Of course you can't use that pocket calculator on the exam. You'll never be using one in real life. So why should you use one now?" Right? That's a bit of the problem, right? These are tools that everybody is always going to be using from now on. And we want people to use those tools and be competent with them and look for ways to enhance our own capabilities. At the same time, it surely cannot be a good idea to rely on them to do all your writing from age 4, for example. So I am very, I say to my students, I used to come into my classrooms and say, close the laptops, put away the phones, because it's my house, my rules. Then I said, I just met Satya Nadella, who was CEO of Microsoft, and he's coming for your job with the AI thing, so put away the phones and the laptops. You need to lean in and focus on being human and what it means to be human and how you create value for other humans, including employers. Now I walk into all my classrooms and say, hey, I just won the Nobel Prize in economics, put away the phones. But you know, that obviously doesn't work for everyone. So look, I think that we're looking for a combination of retaining our humanity, retaining our creativity, not overly depending on the technology, because the work that suggests that your brain becomes addled. Well, I used to be able to read a map extremely well. Now I can still read a map, but I rely on my GPS way too much, right? So that is a human tendency. We tend to be a little bit lazy. We tend to rely on the easy option. And I think as professors, we need to grapple with the fact that we want students to be empowered and enabled as humans, but also to be able to use the technology when appropriate and how to combine it and figure out how to combine it. And that's what the job market is going to want too, and that's what's going to be rewarded in terms of new business creation. So it's a bit of a balance. And maybe as a portfolio of faculty, you have it exactly right.
Well, Simon, thank you very much. This has been a wonderful tour de force on changes in technology and the potential impacts of AI on society. And we will continue with a panel on the world economy, broadening the discussion to the financial system, trade, demographics, and how all that affects Latin America. So stay with us. I will put some more chairs in the podium and we will continue. Thanks.